our next guest is Nigel Topping. His official title is UK High-Level Climate Action Champion for the United Nations Climate Conference, the COP26, which was planned to take place in November 2020 in Glasgow, UK, and it has been postponed to 2021. Now, 2020 was to be the year of climate, in a way, climate action, really. 5 years after the Paris agreement, the moment when the world would come together and take stock of whether there has been progress or not, and what kind of progress, and maybe even up the level of ambition towards reaching the targets set in the Paris Agreement towards 2030 and 2050. And then the COVID-19 pandemic arrived and shook that momentum. It did not extinguish it, but in the minds of some, the health crisis and the economic crisis are reasons for pushing the pause button on climate. Others instead seem to think that the pandemic has actually shown the fragility of the basis of our economic system and of our society, and therefore we should not try to go back to a pre-pandemic world, but we should try to accelerate the transition towards a cleaner and better future. And that's what we're going to talk about climate change and system change with our guest, Nigel Topping. Welcome to TED 2020.
Hi, Bruno. Nice to join you.
I feel that we need to start from COP. This is the centerpiece of the international construct when it comes to the discussion about climate change, but it's definitely an institution that's not very familiar to many. So tell us briefly what it is, and especially why the Glasgow COP26 is so important.
First of all, I should explain what COP stands for, right? Because it's not obvious. It stands for the Conference of the Parties, which means it's the conference of all of the parties to the UN Climate Convention. And as we all know, Paris was a real breakthrough, because Paris was the moment when all the countries of the world and the UN process for climate has a very high consensus threshold. Everyone has to agree. So it's basically every country has individual veto, right? So it's a very high consensus. So Paris was the real breakthrough, and everybody agreed on the long-term goal and the mechanism. The reason that Glasgow is so important is that it's really the first real test of the Paris Agreement. Like, will the Paris Agreement work? Is it working? Because what the Paris Agreement did was it did a couple of things. It gave up on the idea that nearly 200 countries can agree everybody's targets. You imagine the number of combinations. It's kind of ridiculously complex. And that had been the process before, and Paris kind of gave up on that idea, but instead empowered every country to set their most ambitious targets, but realized that you won't get enough ambition first time around. So the second thing that Paris did was said, and every 5 years we'll review everybody's targets and everybody will come back with a new plan. So this is what's happening right now, as the first countries are starting to come up with their revised plan. Chile's submitted theirs, South Korea's made a commitment. We're starting to see them come in. So Paris will be the first real test. Have we, as an international community, been able to ratchet our ambition? That's what we'll find out in Glasgow.
Your job, High-Level Climate Action Champion, that's not exactly a mainstream job title. So what's your role in there?
So the other thing that was special about Paris was that for the first time in the international process, there'd been a recognition that not just national governments, but businesses, investors, cities, states and regions. Remember, California is the 5th biggest economy in the world, and cities like New York and London have much bigger economies and populations than many smaller countries. So all these big real economy actors have a real role in the politics and in the economics of action on climate change. So they were invited in, not into the legal process, but into the informal process to lend their voices as the UN system recognized that all those actions were going to be needed. So in Paris, as well as the Paris Agreement, this role of the High-Level Climate Action Champion was created to work with those communities of businesses, investors, cities, states and regions to keep driving ambition alongside the national process. So there's a kind of a feedback loop between the two.
But in terms of the legal aspects of the discussions, those are still national. It's the political aspect that is more all-encompassing.
the legal agreements are entirely between national governments. So my job is to work with what are sometimes called non-state actors or non-party stakeholders in the UN system. But of course, we all know that politicians look to citizens, they look to investors, they look to businesses. They don't want to get too far away from them. And of course, cities and states and regions have a lot of power in many countries as well. So yeah,
No, but exactly.
the people I work with don't have a formal role, but they have a big political voice. Yeah.
But that puts you in a position where you have one foot close to government and another one close to the many people working on asking for action on climate or pushing back on action on climate. How do you create productive, meaningful dialogue?
I mean, I think first of all, I'm meeting everybody where they are, right? I mean, it's very easy. I mean, I spent the first part of my career in private sector. It's very easy in the private sector to think that politicians don't understand the real world because they don't understand the private sector. But when you actually work with elected politicians, you realize that's a different kind of real world, right? Actually having to go around and get votes, raise money, be elected, maintain your position so that you can have power to change the system. So I think first of all, it's being realistic in meeting people where they are. And then I think I spend a lot of my time acting as a kind of translator or a bridge between different worlds, particularly paying attention to early signals of change, because both incumbent businesses and incumbent politicians are very wary of moving too soon to change. So they tend to look at what the majority are thinking all the time, which means they're kind of cognitively blinded to early signals of change. So I spend a lot of my time searching for and amplifying and pointing to early evidence of the kind of change which we know is inevitable, it has to happen, but the politicians and business leaders have not necessarily been paying enough attention to.
Let's go back in a second to those early signals. But when people from the outside look at the multilateral effort around climate, they may have the impression that it's something a bit dysfunctional, stuck. It's a stuck process, and there is maybe little hope to make progress. We think of the COP25 in Madrid last November, where in any case, if we followed it through the media, it looked like at least a partial disappointment. But when you were offered this job, you took it. So I guess you have a different opinion on that.
Well, I didn't take it because I thought it's a slam dunk. I mean, it's a real challenge, right? We are talking about the complete re-engineering of the global social and economic system, because energy is at the heart of everything we do. So it's not. But I do think that the media. There's a phrase in the media that refers to a cognitive bias that we have to look at negatives. We get more excited and pay more attention to negatives. The media have a phrase that says, "If it bleeds, it leads," and I think that's the story of Madrid. In Madrid. Just a year after the IPCC, that's the International Panel on Climate Change, the panel of scientists, published their report on the difference between a 1.5 degree warming and 2 degree warming, which basically said that it's a massive difference, and for every fraction of a degree we have significant human and economic damage. So it really reset all of our thinking to we've got to go for 1.5 degrees, which means getting to zero by 2050. In the 1 year between that being reported and Madrid, suddenly we had hundreds of businesses and cities and states and regions and lots of countries saying, okay, so we had a massive ratchet in ambition. During the Madrid conference, the continent of Europe, the entire trading bloc, one of the biggest trading economies in the world, committed to net zero by 2050. And yet the media coverage was dominated by protests on the street, which are real and which reflect real discomfort, unease, anger, right on the street, and the failure to negotiate some small bits of the Paris rule book, because that's mostly what's being left to negotiate. They're important politically because that reflects our ability to agree, but they're not as material as the entire European economy to getting to net zero. So I think it is a very complicated process, right? It does require collective action. That's difficult to achieve, but it's not black and white, and it's not failing. We have significant increase in ambition since Paris, and it's still not enough. And by the way, the science is kind of running away from us as well, because every time we look at the science, it gets worse. And in fact, next year now, with a delayed COP, we'll have the sixth set of reports start to come out from the IPCC. And I think we all know that that's going to raise the level of risk again, so it'll put more pressure on to ratchet ambition before Glasgow.
So before the pandemic, there was a growing momentum around climate, from politics to business to citizen, youth activists in the streets, and so on. But now the world is going, is exiting the acute phase of the pandemic, possibly, but entering an economic shock, a global economic shock. And at the same time, the need for radical cuts in greenhouse gas emissions is not gone away. But many people are basically saying, let's postpone talking about climate. Let's roll back regulations. We need to restart the economy. We can think of climate later. And restarting the economy, of course, it's an urgency. So how do we restart the economy without forgetting the urgency of the climate crisis?
I think there is there is a sort of truth to the sense that one must concentrate on the most immediate problem first, right? So I think it is true and understandable that ministers and leaders have focused more on the immediate health crisis and less on the long-term climate crisis, because nobody wants to be told that their long-term health is being secured whilst their short-term health whilst people are literally dying. So the real issue is how do we come out of this? And there's a couple of things I think that we've learnt generally. There are some people who are head in the sand on this, that we really should take the science of risk very seriously. And we understand the science of the risk of climate change very, very well, and it doesn't get better. Right? We already have locked in a lot more temperature rise. So we have locked in more floods, more droughts, more wildfires, more typhoons. So it's not a problem coming somewhere else in another generation. It's coming to us now in our communities all around the world, and it's getting worse. But we also know economically that the solution to climate change is a driver of economic growth and a driver of jobs. So it would be real folly now to ignore the science of risk and to take stupid economic decisions to invest in the jobs that are dying anyway, instead of accelerating the transition to the jobs which will last, which will build wealth, and which will deliver a cleaner and healthier world for us all to live in. So yes, that ideological battle is being fought now. I mean, it seems to me that most countries, and I think we'll hear shortly from the European Union on some of the details of their Green New Deal, are very much looking to invest in cleaning the economy rather than taking a step backwards. If I take one sort of example of a political folly of trying to revive a dying industry, it would be the coal mining in the United States. President Trump's famously invested by saying that he's going to bring back coal. He hasn't, because no one will invest in coal because it's not healthy, and because it's dying economically. So actually we've seen coal-fired power stations shutting under Trump just as fast as under his predecessor, who had a very different ideology. So I think the combination of the health and the technology and the economics means that there's only one direction of travel. And those countries that invest in the past will end up wasting their money and being uncompetitive. And so they'll lose jobs in the future as well. I think there's generally a sense of that, although that's still being contested in some countries, but not in many.
I'm curious, when was the first time that you yourself realized that climate change was real?
I mean, viscerally, in 1987, in Greenland. I was a 21-year-old mountaineer and on an expedition, and we were doing some scientific research on the snout, the end of a glacier, so where the glacier carves into the sea. It's on the east coast of Greenland, the Sermelik Fjord. It's a very big glacier. It's one of the main ones draining the east coast ice sheet. And we got to where we were supposed to be doing the science, which is where on the map the end of the glacier was, and all we could see, it's a big glacier, all we could see was like 2 kilometers of open water with bits of ice floating out to sea. And this is before digital maps, right? So the map was the truth. So this was we were like really shocked. We were like, we thought we must have made a terrible navigational error. It took us a while to realize that we were in exactly the right place, but the glacier had just moved back 20 kilometers. So it was really shocking. And that's really stuck with me. There's never been any doubt in my mind that climate change is real, because once you've seen something physically up front like that, something
Yeah,
that's
but I
not
asked you
there
the
that's on the
question.
map.
Yeah, I asked you the question because I guess that many of us know and acknowledge that climate crisis is real and that we need to change. But we're also, embedded in really complex, big systems, the one that run our life, the economy. And thinking about changing system is really sometimes it's hard and sometimes can be overwhelming. Now, you mentioned before you've been in the private sector. You're a system engineer. So in the past, you've worked on large-scale manufacturing systems, optimizing factories, optimizing supply chains, and so. And I know that in your current role, you have actually set up your teams to work on systemic change. So can you give us a specific example, but in some details about how do you think about that? How do we think about changing complex, big, overwhelming systems?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard because it can be overwhelming, right? Because big complex systems are big and complex. So, and most of our life we break things down into small chunks and work on one part of a system, and that's how we get stuff done, right? You can't work at the level of the whole system. You've got to choose, one direction to work and do that. But when we're confronted with the need to transform systems, I think the first thing is to have a sense of the whole, so to have a sort of map of the whole. So with my team, we look at what all the different levers are. So we take something like the system that produces cars, which leads to a lot of pollution in cities and a lot of CO2 through as we drive cars and burn gasoline, and look at all the different levers that are influencing that system. So it's not just the technology and the policy, though those are important, but also how are investors thinking about that? How's the next generation thinking about that? How are cities thinking about that? So we see, and then we particularly look for early signals of change. So the kind of the evidence that cities are starting to create carbon-free zones or banning combustion engine, or that some companies who exist by leasing cars are starting to commit to go 100% lease plans. My favorite example is nearly 2 million cars in Europe. They've committed to them all being electric by 2030, way before most policymakers have said, and way before most car companies have committed. But they're an early adopter because they see that. So I think seeing the whole system and looking for all those different, not being too precious about knowing exactly what the future is, because you're always surprised. I mean, most people working in climate change, I'd say, were very surprised by the sudden upswing of youth voice through the school strike movement, which has massively changed the politics, but no one was predicting it. So being aware of things that as they pop up and scanning, and then looking at the way they interact with each other. So for example, young people becoming more and more aware of climate change starts to really affect the employment contract. So you find the smartest engineers now don't want to work for companies that haven't got their house in order on climate change, because they want to be solving problems, not contributing to them. So we keep hearing now that the best young engineers are interviewing the companies that they're applying to make sure that they're purposeful enough to want to commit their skills and their intellect to them. So you're looking for those kind of feedback loops that shift the whole system over time.
So what you're saying also is that the future is not something that's there and we walk into it, right? The signpost of the future kind of keeps shifting, because every time one of those decisions that you mentioned from cities, from companies, etc., is taken, then it gives permission to others to be more ambitious or to change their practices or so. Is that what you're suggesting? This kind of dynamics?
And this sort of dynamic way of thinking about the future is really important, because mostly we think very linearly and incrementally. And so we're always surprised at how fast things, even when we know we're always surprised, we're still surprised. So the way I describe it, I live on a street with 10 houses. The way that most thinkers about the future try to predict how many people on my street will have an electric vehicle in 2030 is they look for public commitments to buy an electric vehicle, and they find out that Nigel and Tracy down the street, so they say 2 people out of 10 have committed, so it'll be 20%. They completely ignore the fact that the cost's coming down, that when Nigel buys his Tesla, people are going to look at it and say, oh, can I have a drive? And then that's going to encourage them to buy it. So actually, by the time we get to 2030, 8 or 9 out of 10 are going to have bought. So we're very bad at, this idea that just adding up what people think today tells you what they're going to do in the future. It's kind of silly, but it's quite prevalent. I always think also that the way that we think about the future really matters. And my favorite example is I just read the history of the moon landing. And when JFK said that we were going to land on the moon, lots of people said it's not possible. In particular, some of the best mathematicians in MIT said, but we don't even have the mathematics to calculate the orbital trajectories to land a vehicle on the moon. So that's quite common. That's quite often the response of experts, actually, when a bold target is put out there, is to say why it can't be done. Whereas what JFK did was say, I don't care, we're going to the moon. And eventually those same mathematicians said, okay, well, if we're going to go to the moon, we better figure out those orbital dynamics, and they did, and we went to the moon. So I think there's experts sometimes are very good at saying why we can't do things. We need to insist on the future being the one that we want, so that we unlock some of the creative juices of experts and engineers around the world.
So when we met for the first time a few months ago, you told me a story about shipping and how now the trajectory of global shipping may change because of these dynamics of one decision leads to another, Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, until fairly recently, like say a couple of years ago, there were a series of sectors that were collectively known as the hard to abate sectors. In other words, the ones that we haven't figured out or got around to yet. So it was steel, cement, shipping, aviation, heavy trucking. So we were making good progress on renewable energy and cars, but pretty much everything else we're saying it's hard to abate. And then about 2 years ago, the Energy Transitions Commission published a report showing how we can get to zero in all those. And the report, and I was one of the commissioners, but most of the commissioners were CEOs of energy or heavy energy using companies. So as soon as that report was published, it changed the perception. And around about the same time, Maersk, the biggest container shipping company in the world, said, okay, we commit to being a net zero shipping company by 2050. No one really believed it was possible until that report, and that now we've had Daimler, the inventor of the combustion engine, commit to net zero 2039. We've had steel and cement companies commit to net zero. And then you start planning back. So what if we've got to get to net zero shipping by 2050? Maersk realized they're going to have a zero carbon ship on the water by 2030. That's a long lifetime asset, right? You can't flip the capital base very quickly. So now we have a coalition called the Getting to Zero Coalition, which is shipping companies, fuel companies, ports, countries who've realized that if we have to get to zero by 2050, we have to have the new ships on the water by 2030. And then you kind of go, well, we have to have them built by 2027 because they've got to be tested. We have to have them ordered by 2025, designed by 2023. So you kind of got to know what you're going to build pretty much next year. Is it going to be hydrogen, ammonia, fuel cell? So that really puts pressure on getting some of those decisions, some of the investment done now. So 2050 in many sectors is not a 30-year luxury. It's what we do in the next 5 years that will dictate it.
Absolutely. One of the possible silver linings of COP26 being postponed to next year is that it's not going to be caught into the vortex of the US presidential election campaign of November 2020. Talk to us about the US and the role of US politics in the climate discussion. Maybe we can put it this way. Is the US going to succeed in slowing down action for the rest of the world?
Well, yes. I mean, US is a key player in terms of its economy and its emissions, and was one of the key actors in getting us to Paris. I mean, the relationship between the USA and China, who came out early with a joint statement, and then the USA working with India, was really crucial. So the decision of the current US administration to withdraw from Paris is really, it's damaging. Right? It damages the multilateral system. It kind of legitimizes bad behavior in the multilateral sense. So it's definitely not helpful. But I think the jury's still out on whether that really has the negative effect that it sounds like on the surface. Because remember, America has two redeeming features in the sense of climate ambition. One is it's a federal system, so a lot of power is delegated. So we have many states and cities and companies and universities who've all created an alliance actually called We Are Still In. So they said, the US federal government might be saying we're out, but we're all still in. So they're really building momentum, and that's growing all the time. And the other thing, of course, is the market economy. And as I said, the market really is voting with its dollars. I think the really damaging thing for the USA is most likely to be its own competitiveness. I mean, I really worry for the health of the US automotive industry. The US Detroit famously got the first oil crisis badly wrong in the early 70s, and continue to invest in heavy, inefficient cars. And as a result, a lot of Americans are driving small, light, efficient European, Japanese, Korean cars today. I fear for Detroit that if Detroit doesn't stop colluding with the current administration and rolling back fuel efficiency standards, then by 2030, the rest of the American market will be electric Chinese and European cars, and there'll be, with the possible exception of Tesla, the Detroit will just not exist as a car manufacturing center because they're just strategically getting it so badly wrong now. China's the biggest market in the world. Europe's similar size to America. America can't dictate the technological trajectory for personal mobility. It's being decided elsewhere, and it's going electric, and it's going really fast. And so American companies are missing out. So I think American politics at the federal level is not the only game in town. You look at the distributed politics at the state and city level, and I say California is the 5th biggest economy in the world and has got one of the most ambitious plans to clean up its economy. So the jury's out. And of course, but you're right. I think you are right that it will be helpful that the COP will not be the week after a presidential election, because that would kind of suck all of the media attention out of what goes on in Glasgow.
Let's hear from Whitney if there are questions from the audience.
Sure, we have one question from Shahani Ghosh. Does the world have a responsibility to help rebuild after catastrophic climate change consequences, such as the recent cyclone in India? And why is that not happening in a more globally coordinated way?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, in a way, the inequalities around climate change are at the heart of the political difficulties of getting agreement over the years. I mean, there's a phrase that all negotiators know in the climate negotiation called common but differentiated responsibility. It says that yes, it's a collective responsibility, but some countries cause the problem much more, and some are suffering from it much more. And it's the same within countries, right? We have vulnerable communities within wealthy countries as well. So does the world have a responsibility? I mean, I think the world has a responsibility to do the best job it can to prevent catastrophic climate change, and that feeling of collective responsibility was very much in the room in Paris when the gavel came down. There was a sense that actually collectively we had risen to our better. We were being our better selves. We were not being driven by factional fighting, but we were actually doing what was right for the whole. It's hard to maintain that, right? I mean, you look at I understand the World Health Organization has a budget that's the equivalent of one hospital in the States. So we haven't created a multilateral system that is very well resourced to deal with situations like that. So that's the main reason that it doesn't happen in a coordinated way, is because it's really hard, because the world is set up, dominated by individual sovereign states, and getting people to agree to do things multilaterally is very difficult. That's why the Paris Agreement's so important. One of the things that is being negotiated in the run-up to Glasgow is the provisions for what's called loss and damage, which talk to exactly the kind of issue around how does the world collectively support countries that are going through crises like the cyclone in India right now.
That sounds great. And I'll continue to monitor the questions behind the scenes, and I'll be back with some more.
Thank you, Whitney. You mentioned China, Nigel. It's an interesting case because it's a leader on solar, for example, but at the same time, it's building coal plants, week after week. It kind of embodies the paradox of energy, which is that significant expansion of renewable on one side, but it doesn't really flatten the curve on carbon on the other side. Why so, and what can be done?
Well, it's complex, right? I mean, it's a very big, complex country, and it really has led in solar, wind, electrification. I mean, the buses which Marcelo was talking about that running on the streets of Santiago are built by BYD, big Chinese electric bus company. So they're leading the way in many of those industrial transitions, but it's also a huge economy with a huge energy need. They have been significantly reducing the carbon intensity of their economy, and they've committed to doing that by 2030. And most of us think that they will have turned the corner by then. I think that ultimately the market will take care of coal in China. I mean, coal in China, if you actually look at the stats, coal-fired power stations in China are running at very low utilization levels because they're also built such a lot of renewable power, and the renewable power has zero marginal cost, basically, whereas the coal power has it's complicated by the politics of employment, right? Because China employs a lot of people mining coal, and a lot of those communities don't know what they're due. I mean, we've seen that social dislocation in the States, in Virginia, in my country, in the north of England and the south of Wales, where coal mining communities have been through very painful transitions. So a lot of the work that's at the heart of the energy transition now is to think about what we call just transition. Like, how do we actually manage the transition from a human point of view? So it's not just about getting the technology right. If you have a whole community where where half the people work in coal mining, you can't just say to that community, coal is bad.
Goodbye,
you have to do something. You can't do it. So I think that's what China's grappling with. It's also grappling with the risk of social unrest from dirty air in cities, which is pushing in the clean direction. So my sense is that we might see some knee-jerk reaction in terms of keeping people working, of building some coal-fired power stations in China that we had thought were going to be off the books, but that quite quickly that will change. Interestingly, you might have seen that China's just said it's not going to use GDP growth as its main planning indicator of success, because
at least for the short term. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So it'd be very interesting to see. So I think that China is on a trajectory to wean itself off coal. Remember, even in Europe, Germany, one of the most sophisticated economies in the world, has said it will keep burning coal until 2038. Similar drivers, right? They mine and burn brown coal. It's the dirtiest form of coal. So they've had to negotiate with the communities and with the unions a time frame which most of us think is woefully long. I mean, I would like to see Germany get off coal by 2030, but also understand it's politically very difficult. Again, if you're a politician in that community where most of the jobs are coal, you can't just turn up and say you're all out of a job in 3 years. You have to manage a process.
Absolutely. Nigel, maybe ask you one more question, and then we bring in Whitney, and then there is a final question. But I want to go back to those early signals of change that you mentioned at the beginning. Because if you look at the media and film and social media and books, there is a lot of doom and gloom about climate. But then there are a lot of good news in a way that go almost unnoticed. Give us maybe a couple of examples of those early signals of change or those good news, and why do you think they're important, and how to think about that?
Well, first thing I'd say is don't spend too much time reading all those gloomy books, right? It's really important, because once you've read one, you've read them all, right? If we don't tackle climate change, it's really bad, right? Read a little bit of science, read the IPCC summary report for policymakers, right? Satisfy yourself that the science has been done rigorously, but don't then, because from the bad news alone, no solutions come, right? You have to turn that into a motivation to act. And so you have to go from despair to hope, right? You have to choose to act in the belief that we can avoid the worst of climate change. We can't avoid everything. It's already in train. We're already seeing it. And when you start looking, there's evidence all over the place that we are waking up, that we are getting more ambitious, that the technology costs are going down. Millions of young people striking is a positive sign, right? That's young people saying we're holding our parents' generation to account. And that makes a difference. I've seen policymakers say this has changed the politics forever. I've seen CEOs being asked by their 14-year-old daughter, "What are you doing about it, Daddy?" That's a very powerful signal. The cost of renewables continue to plummet. Solar costs come down 80% in the last 10 years. Battery storage coming down 17% every year. Within a few years, electric vehicles are going to be cheaper than. I don't know why anyone would buy a combustion engine car by 2030. I think we will in that case. Even the oil companies who've been in denial for a long time are now starting to make net zero commitments. South Korea has been financing coal-fired power stations overseas, is still doing so, but has just had a government elected on a net zero 2050 platform, and they've committed to ending. So if you start looking, every country, every community, every sector, you can see signs that we're starting to see exponential change, and the pace is growing. And I think that by the time we get to Glasgow, that really the case will have been made that this is inevitable and it's accelerating. And if you don't want to miss out, then you better get with the program pretty quickly.
Let's see what Whitney has from the audience.
Sure, we have a number of questions coming in from the audience. Our first one here is from Al Gore. What do you think is the most likely for COP26 at this point? Wouldn't it be better to have it during the heat of the Northern Hemisphere summer going forward?
Hi, Al. Thanks for the question. I don't know. I've been working with my team on the contingency of somewhere between May and November next year. I think we'll find out very soon. The decision is made by a body called the COP Bureau, which is a subset of about, I think, 11 members of different countries representing the different blocks of countries. At the moment, I'd say I think it's looking more likely to be later in the year. We have local elections in the UK in May. That makes it difficult. June is the European Football Championships, which means, and Glasgow is one of the host cities, so the policing two major events like that I think is impossible. So we're starting to look later. July might be possible. August, nobody in Europe works in August, so that's impossible. Then we start running into the UN program in September, and we've got to fit a G7 and a G20, and so I think the smart money is probably on the autumn, but we'll know, I think, within a week, Al, and then we can all plan concretely and stop speculating.
And we have a ton of other questions, and just in the interest of time, I will just ask one more. We're having a little bit of a tech glitch with showing some of the questions, so I'm going to actually read this one out. It's from our community member, Jadida Eisler. How can we meaningfully connect grassroots efforts and these large-scale system approaches? How do we engage both meaningfully?
Well, so I think grassroots is part of the system, right? And they are connected. You can't be not connected to systems change. So everything that grassroots movements are doing, when people take to the street and say we want more climate action, that's systems change, right? When a 15-year-old asks his or her father or mother, who's the CEO of an oil company, what are they doing about climate change? That's systems change. So never underestimate what small actions can do. It could be 10 million kids on the streets. Or it could be, one student asking their university why they're still investing in companies that aren't taking climate change seriously. All of those have ramifications, and so never think that because you're only one small person or your grassroots that you don't have systems impact. Those noises, when they're heard, that's the trick to break through, often have a disproportionate impact. When CEOs start realizing that young people, that university students, don't like the trajectory their company's going in, so they won't buy their products or they won't work for them, that has a profound effect. So yeah, you are a systems change agent if you're a grassroots activist. So keep it up.
That's great.
Nigel, let's maybe end on a question that has to do with the individuals who feel overwhelmed by this necessity to change big systems. Because people do wonder, what can I do as an individual? Can you share maybe one or two ideas about, what is the individual action plan to contribute meaningfully to fighting climate change?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's entirely normal to feel overwhelmed, right? I mean, I first knew that I was probably going to be going into this job just before the Madrid COP, and I got formally appointed at the beginning of February this year. But I do remember walking around Madrid with like 30,000 people there, all trying to solve this intractable problem and feeling extremely overwhelmed. And I have a lot of agency at the heart of this process. So I'd say don't feel bad if you feel overwhelmed, but just don't get stuck being overwhelmed, right? There's lots of books with ideas of what to do. I think there's two levels you can think about this. One is your own footprint. And remember, we need to halve in 10 years. So just don't think about it as tomorrow. In 10 years, you can shift your electricity supply to being fully renewable. You can actually do that in a few days. If you do own a car, you can decide you're never going to buy another car, or your next car will be a shared electric car, or it'll be an electric car. So the combination of renewable electricity and electric car, that's taken a massive chunk. You can shift, anytime you upgrade any big piece of capital equipment like a boiler or a stove, you can shift from gas to electric. So you're going from fossil to now renewable power. You can look at your diet. I mean, intensively farmed meat is a big part of the problem. So you can look at your diet. Again, there's lots of you can read a lot about how diet. You don't have to go off meat completely. There's sustainably farmed meat, but a lot of red meat is bad for your health, and it's bad for the health of the planet. So there's if you fly a lot, you can use this technology more. Maybe say I'm going to halve my flights in the next 5 years, right? So you have individual power over all sorts of things. The other thing is you're a member of all sorts of groups. If you're a student, you're in a school or a university, ask the question about the school or university's plan to get to net zero, what it does with its investments. If you have a pension, ask your pension fund, how are they working on this? If you're an employee in a company, ask the company where its net zero plan is. And I know that a lot of the educational tools and the work of TED Countdown will be helping people to engage more granularly. But there's always something you can do, and there's always people who want to do it with you. And never give up, right? Because you never know when one more question is the one that finally gets to head office and has a change of policy. So keep prodding away.
Nigel, thank you for being with us for this hour and sharing your knowledge and your challenge really with us. Good luck for that. Good luck to you and your team. It's reassuring to know that there are people like you and your team working on this. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno. It's a pleasure.